Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something absolutely brutal. Three stories that'll completely destroy any romanticized ideas you have about Viking life. We're talking about why you'd probably die horribly as a Viking warrior, why living in a longhouse would be your personal nightmare, and why being a Viking woman was basically a survival horror game on expert mode. Forget everything Hollywood taught you about glorious Viking adventures. These stories are going to show you the savage reality. So before we jump in, smash that like button if you're ready for some serious historical reality checks. And subscribe if you want more stories that'll make you grateful you live in the 21st century. Drop a comment letting me know if you think you could actually survive Viking life. I'm betting most of you will change your minds real quick. Now grab your favorite drink. Maybe put on an extra blanket because you're about to feel cold just thinking about this. And let's dive into three stories that prove Viking life was way more terrifying and miserable than anyone wants to admit. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll be kissing the ground you live on modern plumbing and central heating. First up, we're heading to 9th century Scandinavia, where your dreams of being a badass Viking warrior are about to get completely demolished. Why you wouldn't last a season as a Viking warrior. Picture this. It's 873 CE, and you're standing on the windswept shores of the Limfjord in Denmark, watching a dragon-proud longship slice through the choppy waters. The salt spray stings your face, and the bitter North Sea wind cuts through your woolen cloak like it's made of cobwebs. You've been recruited, or more accurately, press-ganged, into joining Halfdan the Black's warband for a raiding season in Anglo-Saxon England. The romanticized image of bloodthirsty berserkers pillaging monasteries while screaming about Valhalla. Yeah, forget all that Hollywood nonsense. You're about to discover why being a Viking warrior wasn't the glorious adventure you thought it would be. The harsh reality of Viking recruitment. First off, let's shatter the myth that Viking warriors were some elite brotherhood of professional soldiers. Most of you reading this would have been farmers, fishermen, or craftsmen who got swept up in the seasonal raiding economy out of pure economic necessity. The climate crisis of the 9th century, yes, they had those too, had made harvests unpredictable across Scandinavia. Your barley crop failed for the third year running, your livestock died in the harsh winter, and suddenly, that silver arm ring the Jarl is offering looks pretty appealing. You're not some battle-hardened warrior with years of training. You're Bjorn, the barley grower, and your combat experience consists of breaking up tavern brawls and slaughtering the occasional pig. The warriors around you are equally unimpressive. Teenage boys whose voices still crack when they try to sound intimidating. Middle-aged farmers with beer bellies, and desperate men running from debts or blood feuds. The grizzled veterans who actually know what they're doing. They make up maybe 20% of any raiding party. Your training consists of a few weeks of learning to swing an axe without cutting off your own foot, basic shield wall formations, and how to row a longship without catching a crab that sends your oar handle into your neighbor's ribs. The weapon you've been given is a simple spear, not because spears are noble weapons, but because they're cheap to make, and you can stab people while hiding behind more experienced fighters. The brutal truth about Viking ships. Now let's talk about that longship you'll be calling home for the next several months. Sure, they look impressive in museums, But living on one is like being trapped in a wooden coffin with 30 other unwashed men. The Gokstad ship, one of the best preserved examples we have, was only 76 feet long and 17 feet wide. Do the math? That's less than 45 square feet per person, assuming you don't need space for supplies, weapons, or the massive steering oar. There are no beds, no privacy, no bathrooms, and certainly no protection from the elements. You sleep on the deck, wrapped in a soggy woolen cloak, with the guy next to you's elbow in your ribs and his feet in your face. When nature calls, you either hold it until you make landfall or hang your ass over the side while your shipmates hold your belt to keep you from falling overboard. Privacy is a luxury you can't afford when you're crammed together like salted fish in a barrel. The smell alone would break most modern people. 30 men who haven't bathed in weeks, combined with the stench of rotting food scraps, bilge water, and the occasional corpse, because yes, people die on these voyages, creates an olfactory assault that would make a medieval cesspit seem fragrant. Your nose will stop working after a few days, which is both a blessing and a curse. You'll also lose your ability to smell danger, like smoke from an approaching enemy fleet. The myth of Viking seamanship. But Vikings were master sailors. You protest. Sure, the navigators were skilled, but that doesn't mean the journey was pleasant or safe. These ships had no compass, no maps as we understand them, and navigation relied on reading the stars, the color of the water, the flight patterns of birds, and the taste of the sea spray. Yes, you read that right. Experienced navigators would literally taste the ocean to determine their location. The North Sea in autumn is a death trap. Sudden storms can whip up waves that would make your longship dance like a cork in a bathtub. The ship has no deck cover, so when those waves start crashing over the gunwales, you're bailing water with leather buckets while trying not to get swept overboard. The mortality rate for Viking expeditions was roughly 30 to 40%, and drowning was the leading cause of death, not glorious battle wounds. Your food consists of dried fish, stale bread, and sour ale, assuming the supplies don't spoil or get soaked by seawater. Scurvy will start setting in after a few weeks, making your gums bleed and your teeth loosen. That romantic image of Vikings feasting on roasted meat only happens when you successfully raid a settlement and can actually cook something. Which brings us to our next delightful topic: the reality of Viking raids. Popular culture has painted Viking raids as these dramatic, choreographed battles where warriors charge screaming into combat. The reality was far more mundane and brutal. Most successful raids targeted defenseless monasteries, small villages, or merchant ships. You're not fighting noble knights in shining armor. You're terrorizing monks, farmers, and craftsmen who have no military training. The typical raid went like this: land before dawn, surround the target, and overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and surprise. The battle usually lasted minutes, not hours. Your job wasn't to engage in honorable single combat. It was to grab as much portable wealth as possible and get out before reinforcements arrived. That meant hauling heavy chests of silver, awkward church ornaments, and struggling captives back to your ship, while wearing 40 pounds of mail and carrying weapons. But here's where things get interesting. You're not just a raider, you're also a businessman. Every piece of loot has to be appraised, divided, and transported. That ornate golden chalice might look valuable, but it's also heavy, and ship space is limited. Those silk robes are worth a fortune, but they'll be ruined if they get wet. And don't get me started on managing human captives. They need to be fed, guarded, and kept alive for the slave markets in Dublin or Constantinople. The economics of Viking warfare. The dirty secret about Viking raids is that they were essentially maritime pyramid schemes. The Jarl who organized the expedition gets the largest share, the ship's captain gets the second largest, and everyone else divides the remainder based on their contribution and reputation. As a first-time raider, you're at the bottom of this hierarchy, which means you might go home with enough silver to buy a decent pair of shoes, if you're lucky. The math is brutal. A successful raid might net 200 pounds of silver, but that's divided among 30 to 40 men after the Jarl takes his cut. Your share might be worth 3 months' wages for a farmer, but you've risked your life, spent months away from home, and probably contracted some exotic disease in the process. The Vikings who got rich weren't the fighters. They were the organizers, the ship owners, and the traders who knew how to convert stolen goods into long-term wealth. And that's assuming everything goes according to plan. Anglo-Saxon England in the 9th century wasn't the defenseless target many Vikings expected. King Alfred the Great had reorganized the English military system, creating a network of fortified towns, burhs, and a standing army that could respond quickly to raids. By the time you're operating, the easy targets have either been fortified or abandoned, and the English have learned to fight back effectively. The psychological toll. Let's talk about what constant violence does to the human psyche. You're not a psychopath. You're a farmer who's been thrust into a world where survival depends on your ability to kill strangers. The first time you plunge a spear into another human being, the sensation is nothing like what you expected. The resistance of flesh, the wet sound of punctured organs, the weight of a dying man collapsing against your weapon. It's going to haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. Viking society had rituals and frameworks for processing violence, but they don't make it easier. The concept of battle fury wasn't about berserkers frothing at the mouth. It was a psychological state that allowed warriors to function in combat without being paralyzed by the horror of what they were doing. Some men found this state easily. Others never found it at all and became liabilities in battle. The constant threat of death creates a hypervigilance that's exhausting to maintain. You're always scanning for threats, always ready to fight, always wondering if the next settlement will be your last. Sleep becomes elusive, food loses its taste, and the camaraderie of your fellow warriors becomes the only thing keeping you sane. This is why Viking warbands developed such strong bonds. They were mutual support groups for men processing trauma together. The seasonal campaign. A typical raiding season lasted from spring to autumn, roughly 6 months of constant danger and discomfort. You'd spend weeks sailing between targets, days conducting raids, and precious little time actually resting. The campaign follows the agricultural calendar. You need to be back home for the harvest, assuming you survive long enough to see it. The first raid of the season is always the most dangerous because your crew is rusty and uncoordinated. Men make mistakes, formations fall apart, and people die unnecessarily. Those who survive learn quickly or become casualties. By midsummer, assuming you haven't been killed or crippled, you've developed the 1,000-yard stare of a combat veteran. You move efficiently, kill without hesitation, and sleep with one hand on your weapon. But here's the thing nobody tells you. The raids get harder as the season progresses. Word spreads about your activities, and coastal communities start preparing defenses. That monastery you hit in May has been abandoned by August. That trading post you raided in June now has a garrison of soldiers waiting for your return. The easy targets disappear, forcing you to take greater risks for smaller rewards. The brutal hierarchy. Viking society was strictly hierarchical, and nowhere was this more apparent than in a warband. The Jarl or expedition leader might be a skilled politician and warrior, but he's also a man who's comfortable sending you to your death for a few ounces of silver. The ship's captain controls your fate on the water, deciding when to fight, when to flee, and when to sacrifice crew members for the greater good. The experienced warriors form an inner circle that looks out for each other while treating newcomers as expendable. They get the best equipment, the choicest loot, and the safest positions in battle. Your spear and leather jerkin are no match for their swords and mail shirts. When the shield wall breaks, they're the ones who survive while you die face down in the mud. Social mobility exists, but it's based on survival and success, not fairness. If you somehow manage to distinguish yourself in battle, accumulate some wealth, and live through multiple campaigns, you might eventually join the veteran circle. But the vast majority of first-time raiders never make it past their inaugural season. They die of disease, drown in storms, fall in battle, or simply disappear into the anonymity of history. The home front. While you're off playing warrior, life at home continues without you. Your wife is managing the farm, caring for the children, and dealing with the local politics you've abandoned. If you die, she'll get no compensation beyond whatever meager wealth you've managed to send home. If you're captured, she'll have to assume you're dead and move on with her life. The children you're supposedly fighting to provide for will grow up without their father's guidance. Your son might resent you for choosing adventure over family responsibility, or he might idealize your absence and repeat your mistakes. Your daughter will learn that men are expendable creatures who abandon their families for the promise of easy wealth. The farm you've neglected will suffer from your absence. Crops need tending, animals need care, and repairs need making. Your neighbors might help initially, but they have their own problems to deal with. By the time you return, if you return, months of neglect will have cost you more than you could possibly gain from raiding. The violence of medieval combat. Let's dispel another myth. Medieval combat wasn't a clean, honorable affair where brave warriors faced each other in single combat. It was a chaotic, terrifying mess where survival depended more on luck than skill. Your primary weapons are a spear and a shield, and you'll be fighting in a formation called a shield wall. Essentially, a human hedge of overlapping shields and protruding spear points. The shield wall works by collective action, but it's only as strong as its weakest member. When exhausted, frightened farmers start dropping their shields or breaking formation, the entire line collapses. You're not fighting as an individual hero. You're a cog in a machine that depends on everyone doing their job simultaneously. The reality of spear fighting is that you're trying to stab people while they're trying to stab you, all while maintaining formation and watching for threats from multiple directions. Your shield weighs 15 pounds, and your spear weighs 4 pounds. So your arms will be screaming with fatigue after minutes of combat. The mail shirt you're wearing, if you're lucky enough to have one, weighs 40 pounds and makes every movement more difficult. The aftermath of battle. Assuming you survive a battle, the aftermath is almost as dangerous as the fighting itself. Wounded men need care, and medieval medicine consists of binding wounds with dirty cloth and hoping for the best. Infections kill more warriors than weapons do, and there's no understanding of antiseptics or sterile conditions. The psychological impact is immediate and severe. You've just experienced the most intense terror and violence of your life, and there's no counseling or support system beyond the grim camaraderie of your fellow survivors. Some men become addicted to the adrenaline rush of combat. Others develop what we'd now recognize as PTSD and become liabilities in future battles. The dead need to be dealt with, and that's everyone's responsibility. You'll be stripping corpses of valuable equipment, digging mass graves, and trying to identify bodies well enough to send word to families. The smell of death and decay will cling to your clothes and hair for weeks. You'll taste it in your food and smell it in your sleep. The long road home. If you somehow manage to survive the entire season, the journey home presents its own challenges. Your ship is loaded with loot, captives, and wounded men, making it slower and more vulnerable to attack. Autumn storms in the North Sea are legendary for their ferocity, and many successful raiders died within sight of home when their overladen ships foundered in rough seas. The wealth you've accumulated needs to be converted into useful goods or invested wisely. Raw silver is impressive, but it won't feed your family through the winter. You need to find traders, negotiate exchanges, and hope you're not being cheated by merchants who know more about commerce than you do. The psychological adjustment to civilian life is jarring. You've spent months in a state of constant alertness, making life or death decisions daily. Now you're expected to care about crop rotation and property disputes. Your family has adapted to your absence, and you're essentially a stranger in your own home. The statistics of survival. Let's talk numbers, because they're sobering. Archaeological evidence suggests that the average Viking warrior had a life expectancy of about 35 to 40 years, compared to 50 to 60 years for farmers and craftsmen. The mortality rate for first-time raiders was approximately 40%, meaning that 2 out of every 5 men who joined a warband never came home. The leading causes of death weren't glorious battle wounds. They were drowning, disease, and accidents. Storms sank more Viking ships than enemy action ever did. Dysentery killed more warriors than swords. Infected wounds from minor injuries claimed more lives than dramatic battlefield deaths. The successful survivors were either extremely lucky, exceptionally skilled, or smart enough to quit while they were ahead. The vast majority of career Vikings died young, poor, and far from home. The few who accumulated significant wealth usually transitioned into trading, shipbuilding, or organizing raids, rather than participating in them. The myth versus reality. Popular culture has created this image of Vikings as fearless warriors who lived for battle and died gloriously in combat. The reality is that most Viking raiders were scared, homesick farmers who desperately wanted to survive long enough to see their families again. They weren't superhuman berserkers. They were ordinary men, pushed to extraordinary circumstances by economic necessity. The famous death in battle guarantees Valhalla belief was more complicated than modern interpretations suggest. Norse religion emphasized honor and courage, but it also valued wisdom, loyalty, and family responsibility. A man who died uselessly in a hopeless battle wasn't necessarily more honorable than one who lived to protect his community. The archaeological record shows that most Vikings lived quiet, productive lives focused on farming, crafting, and trade. The raiders who dominate our historical imagination were a small minority of the population, and even they typically only raided for a few seasons before settling down to normal life. The economic reality. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Viking raiding was economically irrational for individual participants. The average raider's share of loot was less than what he could have earned staying home and focusing on his trade. The mortality rate was astronomical, the time investment was enormous, and the long-term consequences for family and community were devastating. The people who profited from Viking raids were the organizers, the ship owners, and the traders who converted stolen goods into sustainable wealth. The foot soldiers who did the actual fighting and dying were essentially exploited labor, risking their lives to enrich their social superiors. This economic reality helps explain why Viking raiding eventually declined. As Scandinavian societies became more prosperous and organized, fewer men were willing to risk their lives for marginal economic gains. The development of stronger defenses in target areas made raiding more dangerous and less profitable, accelerating the transition to legitimate trade and settlement. The cultural impact. Despite the mythology, Viking culture wasn't built around warfare. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated artistic traditions, complex legal systems, and extensive trade networks that had nothing to do with raiding. The famous Viking law codes emphasized compensation over revenge, suggesting a society that preferred negotiation to violence. Women held significant power in Viking society, managing households, conducting trade, and influencing political decisions. The warrior culture was just one aspect of a complex civilization that valued poetry, craftsmanship, and exploration alongside martial prowess. The transition from raiding to settlement in places like England, Ireland, and Normandy shows that Vikings were adaptable people who could integrate into existing societies when circumstances favored peace over war. The descendants of Viking raiders became farmers, merchants, and administrators who contributed to the development of medieval European civilization. The personal cost. Let's end with the personal cost, because that's what really matters. If you somehow survived a season as a Viking warrior, you'd return home forever changed. You'd have seen things that would haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. You'd carry physical scars from wounds that never properly healed. You'd struggle to relate to people who hadn't shared your experiences. The wealth you'd accumulated, if any, would pale in comparison to what you'd lost. Your relationship with your family would be strained by months of absence and the psychological damage of constant violence. Your place in the community would be uncertain, as people wondered whether you were still the same person who'd left months earlier. The young men who looked up to you as a successful warrior would have no idea what it actually cost you. They'd see the silver arm rings and the stories of distant lands, but they wouldn't understand the nightmares, the guilt, and the knowledge that you'd survived while better men died. The final reckoning. The truth about Viking warriors is that they were ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. They weren't superhuman berserkers or fearless adventurers. They were farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen who made a desperate gamble with their lives. Most of them lost that gamble, dying far from home in service to chiefs who saw them as expendable resources. The few who survived and prospered were either extremely lucky or smart enough to transition out of raiding into safer, more sustainable occupations. The mythology of Viking warrior culture was largely created by people who never had to live it themselves. So the next time you watch a movie or read a book about glorious Viking warriors, remember Bjorn the barley grower and the thousands of men like him who died anonymous deaths in foreign lands, far from the families they tried to provide for. Their sacrifice built the foundation for the myths we tell ourselves about honor and glory. But the reality was far more complex and tragic than any Hollywood production would dare to acknowledge. The lasting legacy of the Viking Age isn't the warrior culture that dominates popular imagination. It's the reminder that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when pushed to desperation, and that the cost of those extraordinary things is almost always higher than anyone expects to pay. Why you wouldn't last a day in a Viking longhouse. So you survived the raiding season. Congratulations. You're now part of the 60% who made it back alive. But before you start celebrating your triumphant return to civilization, let's talk about what home actually means in 9th century Scandinavia. That cozy image of Vikings gathered around a roaring fire, sharing mead and epic stories. Yeah, we need to have a serious conversation about reality versus your Pinterest-fueled fantasies. Welcome to the Longhouse, a 100-foot-long wooden prison where you'll be spending the next 6 months of winter darkness crammed together with 30 to 50 other people, half a dozen families, various livestock, and enough interpersonal drama to make a reality TV show look peaceful. You think you know what claustrophobia feels like? You're about to get a masterclass from the Norse masters of communal living. The architecture of misery. Picture this. It's October 876 CE, and you've just returned to your family's longhouse in the Sognfjord region of Norway. The structure looming before you is impressive from the outside, 100 feet long, 20 feet wide, with elaborately carved dragon heads adorning the peaked roof. But step inside, and you'll quickly realize you've entered what amounts to a medieval commune designed by someone who clearly hated privacy, personal space, and basic human dignity. The longhouse is essentially one enormous room with a central hearth running down the middle, creating a permanent haze of smoke that'll have you coughing like a medieval chimney sweep within hours. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof that lets out maybe half the smoke, while letting in all the rain, snow, and whatever birds are unfortunate enough to fall through. The walls are made of wooden planks, caulked with moss and animal hair, which sounds rustic and charming until you realize it's about as weatherproof as a screen door. Your bedroom consists of a raised platform along one wall, separated from your neighbors by hanging woolen curtains that provide all the privacy of a hospital gown. You'll be sharing this space with your spouse, your children, your elderly parents, and probably a couple of cousins who couldn't afford their own place. The platform is maybe 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide, which means you're essentially living in a medieval bunk bed for the next 6 months. The hierarchy of hell. Here's where things get interesting. The longhouse isn't just housing, it's a physical representation of social hierarchy that'll remind you exactly where you stand in the pecking order every waking moment. The head of the household, usually the patriarch or the local jarl, occupies the high seat at the far end of the hall. This isn't just a place to sit. It's a throne room, courtroom, and executive boardroom all rolled into one. Your position in the longhouse directly correlates to your social status. The closer you are to the high seat, the more important you are. The further towards the door you are relegated, the lower you're standing. And guess what? As a returning warrior with no significant wealth or political connections, you're sleeping near the door where every blast of Arctic wind reminds you of your place in the world. The Jarl's family gets the warmest spots near the central hearth, the choicest food, and the most comfortable sleeping arrangements. You get the cold end where the animals are brought in during storms, the dampest spots where the roof leaks, and the privilege of being the first to deal with any midnight visitors, whether they're human raiders or hungry wolves. The livestock situation. Let's talk about your roommates, because about half of them walk on 4 legs, and none of them understand bathroom etiquette. During the harsh Scandinavian winter, the longhouse becomes a combination human dwelling and barn. Cows, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens all share your living space, bringing with them all the sights, sounds, and smells you'd expect from a medieval petting zoo. The animals are kept at the far end of the longhouse from the high seat, which means if you're low on the social ladder, you're bunking with the livestock. That cow named Brunhilde isn't just your neighbor. She's your alarm clock, your space heater, and your primary source of entertainment during the long winter months. You'll know her digestive schedule better than your own family's. The smell is indescribable. Imagine the world's worst barn mixed with a medieval locker room, seasoned with wood smoke and human sweat, then concentrated in an enclosed space for 6 months. Your clothes will absorb these odors so thoroughly that you'll carry them with you everywhere. Visiting other longhouses becomes an olfactory comparison game. Well, at least their pigs smell better than ours. The sanitation nightmare. Medieval hygiene was, let's call it, different. There's no running water, no sewage system, and certainly no concept of personal hygiene as we understand it. The longhouse's approach to sanitation can best be described as organic and communal, which are fancy ways of saying disgusting and disease-breeding. Human waste is disposed of in a communal pit outside the longhouse, assuming you can make it there in time during a blizzard. More often, you'll be using a chamber pot that gets emptied when someone remembers to do it. The smell of human waste mingles with animal waste, rotting food scraps, and the general funk of unwashed bodies to create an atmosphere that would make a modern sewage treatment plant seem fragrant. Bathing is a weekly activity at best, and it's a communal affair involving a shared wooden tub and water that's been used by half the household before it gets to you. The water is heated by dropping red-hot stones into it, which means you're essentially boiling in other people's dirt. The soap is made from animal fat and wood ash, giving it the consistency of chunky peanut butter and the cleaning power of liquid sandpaper. The food situation. Forget everything you think you know about Viking feasts. The winter diet in a longhouse consisted primarily of preserved foods that had been prepared months earlier, and the preservation methods of the 9th century were primitive. Your staple foods include dried fish that's hard enough to use as a weapon, fermented milk products that smell like they've already gone bad, and various pickled vegetables that bear little resemblance to anything edible. The daily meal routine revolves around a communal pot of porridge that's been simmering over the central fire for days. Everyone eats from this pot using wooden spoons and bowls that haven't been properly cleaned since the last feast. The porridge contains whatever ingredients are available: barley, oats, dried peas, and whatever meat scraps haven't gone completely rancid. Fresh food is rare and precious. When animals are slaughtered, the meat is consumed immediately or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. The choicest cuts go to the highest-ranking household members, while you get whatever's left. Usually organ meats, gristle, and bones with bits of meat still attached. You'll become intimately familiar with the taste of blood sausage, pickled herring, and fermented shark that's been buried in the ground for months. The social dynamics. Living in such close quarters creates a pressure cooker of interpersonal relationships that would challenge even the most diplomatic person. Every conversation is public, every argument is communal entertainment, and every personal problem becomes everyone's business. Privacy is not just rare, it's literally impossible. The longhouse operates under a complex web of social rules and hierarchies that determine everything from where you sit to when you speak. The Jarl's word is law, but beneath him is a tangled network of family relationships, marriage alliances, and personal grudges that affect every aspect of daily life. That minor disagreement you had with your neighbor about property boundaries 6 months ago, it's now a recurring source of tension that'll poison the atmosphere for the entire winter. Women hold significant power in the longhouse, managing the household, supervising food preparation, and mediating disputes. But this power comes with constant responsibility. They're essentially running a combination hotel, restaurant, and diplomatic mission for months at a time. The matriarch of the household can make your life comfortable or miserable, depending on how well you navigate the social currents. The entertainment crisis. 6 months of darkness and confinement requires entertainment, and the options are limited. The famous Viking storytelling traditions are real, but they're also your only escape from the crushing monotony of longhouse life. The same stories get told over and over, with minor variations that become subjects of heated debate. You'll hear the tale of Thor's hammer so many times that you'll want to throw the hammer yourself. Board games are popular, particularly a strategy game called Age Nefatafel that's essentially medieval chess. But when you're playing the same opponents every night for months, strategies become predictable and games become grudge matches. That friendly competition turns into serious rivalry when there's literally nothing else to do. Music is another form of entertainment, but it's also a social minefield. The ability to compose and perform poetry is highly valued, but it's also dangerous. Satirical verses can start feuds that last for generations. Make fun of someone's appearance or prowess in a poem, and you might find yourself dealing with a formal challenge to single combat come spring. The alcohol factor. Let's address the elephant in the room: alcohol consumption. The stereotype of hard-drinking Vikings isn't entirely wrong, but it's more complicated than you might think. Alcohol serves multiple functions in longhouse life. It's a social lubricant, a calorie source, and a way to make contaminated water safer to drink. But it's also a catalyst for every interpersonal conflict that's been brewing under the surface. The longhouse's supply of mead, ale, and wine is carefully managed by the household head. Alcohol is distributed according to social rank, with the most important people getting the strongest drink and the largest portions. As a low-ranking household member, you'll be getting the watered-down leftovers, which is probably for the best, considering what happens when Vikings drink. Drunk Vikings in an enclosed space are like a powder keg waiting to explode. Arguments escalate quickly, old grudges resurface, and the confined space means there's nowhere to escape when things get violent. The longhouse's collection of weapons, axes, swords, and spears, are always within reach, turning every drinking session into a potential bloodbath. The violence problem. Speaking of violence, let's talk about conflict resolution in a space where 50 people are crammed together for months. The legal system recognizes that some level of violence is inevitable, but it also provides frameworks for managing it. The concept of where killed, blood money, means that most conflicts can be resolved through compensation rather than revenge. But the longhouse creates unique problems. When someone insults your wife, steals your food, or just breathes too loudly while you're trying to sleep, you can't just walk away. You have to live with that person for months, seeing them every day, sharing meals, and maintaining some semblance of social cooperation. The psychological pressure is enormous. The head of the household serves as judge and mediator, but they're also dealing with their own stress and frustration. Justice becomes a matter of maintaining order rather than pursuing fairness. Minor disputes are handled through public shaming, fines, or temporary exile to the animal end of the longhouse. Major conflicts might result in someone being thrown out entirely, which in winter conditions is essentially a death sentence. The women's perspective. The longhouse is officially a patriarchal space, but the reality is that women run the day-to-day operations. The lady of the house manages food distribution, oversees textile production, and coordinates the complex web of relationships that keep the household functioning. She's essentially the CEO of a medieval corporation, making decisions that affect everyone's survival. But this power comes with enormous stress. Women are responsible for making limited resources stretch through the winter, managing personality conflicts, and maintaining the social harmony that keeps everyone from killing each other. They're also dealing with their own confinement and frustration, while being expected to keep everyone else happy and productive. The gender dynamics create additional tension. Men who've returned from raiding seasons are used to the violence and excitement of warfare. Being confined to domestic space under female management can be psychologically challenging for people who have spent months making life and death decisions. The result is often a power struggle that plays out in subtle ways throughout the winter. The disease factor. Close quarters, poor sanitation, and limited medical knowledge make the longhouse a perfect breeding ground for disease. Respiratory infections spread like wildfire when 50 people are sharing the same air for months. Skin conditions, parasites, and digestive problems are constant companions. The mortality rate during winter months, was significantly higher than during the active season. The medical understanding of the time attributed illness to supernatural causes, evil spirits, curses, or divine punishment. Treatment involved a combination of herbal remedies, prayers, and rituals that were often more dangerous than the original condition. The longhouse's resident wise woman or healer might be knowledgeable about local plants and traditional remedies, but they're also working with limited resources and pre-scientific understanding. When someone dies in the longhouse, and someone usually does, the body has to be dealt with in winter conditions. This means either storing the corpse outside in the cold until spring burial can be arranged, or conducting winter funeral rites in conditions that would challenge even the most stoic mourners. The psychological impact of living with death in such close quarters affects everyone's mental health. The psychological toll. 6 months of confinement in crowded, uncomfortable conditions takes a serious psychological toll. Modern psychology recognizes the symptoms of seasonal affective disorder, cabin fever, and clinical depression. But 9th century Vikings had no framework for understanding these conditions. They were just winter madness, or the dark mood that affected people when the sun disappeared. The lack of privacy means that mental health struggles become public spectacles. Someone dealing with depression can't hide in their room. They're on display for the entire household. Anxiety, anger, and despair become communal problems that affect the entire group's morale. The social pressure to maintain a stoic appearance makes things worse, creating a cycle of suppressed emotions and explosive outbursts. The longhouse's social hierarchy means that mental health support is limited and unevenly distributed. High-ranking members of the household might receive sympathy and accommodation, while lower-ranking individuals are expected to suffer in silence. The result is a pressure cooker of psychological problems that builds throughout the winter and often explodes in the spring. The children's experience. Children in the longhouse face unique challenges. They're growing up in a space where privacy doesn't exist, where adult conflicts are constant entertainment, and where the rules of behavior are complex and unforgiving. The educational system consists of listening to adult conversations, watching adult behavior, and learning through trial and error. Child mortality. Rates in longhouse conditions were astronomical. Diseases that would be minor inconveniences for adults could be fatal for children. The combination of poor nutrition, limited medical care, and exposure to every illness that passes through the household creates a survival of the fittest environment that would horrify modern parents. The psychological development of children in these conditions is fascinating and disturbing. They learn to navigate complex social hierarchies from an early age, developing political skills that would impress modern diplomats. But they also grow up with normalized violence, limited emotional expression, and an understanding that life is brutal and uncertain. The Spring Awakening. When spring finally arrives, the longhouse transforms from a prison into a launching pad for the year's activities. The accumulated tension of winter confinement explodes into a flurry of activity as people escape the confines of communal living. But the psychological scars of winter remain, affecting relationships and behavior throughout the active season. The first warm day brings a mass exodus from the longhouse as people desperate for space and fresh air flee the confines of their winter prison. The cleaning process is monumental. Months of accumulated filth, waste and debris have to be cleared out before the space can be used again. The smell alone requires weeks of airing out. The social dynamics established during winter carry over into the active season. Alliances formed during the dark months become the basis for raiding parties, trading ventures, and marriage negotiations. Conflicts that simmered through the winter explode into feuds that might last for generations. The longhouse isn't just a building. It's a social laboratory that shapes the entire community's future. The economic reality. The longhouse represents a massive economic investment that determines the entire household's survival. The building costs, maintenance requirements, and resource consumption are enormous. A single longhouse might represent years of accumulated wealth and labor from dozens of people. The economic pressure to make it work creates additional stress for everyone involved. The resource management required to keep 50 people alive for 6 months is staggering. Food storage, fuel consumption, and basic supplies have to be calculated months in advance. A single miscalculation can mean starvation, hypothermia, or worse. The head of the household carries the weight of these decisions, but everyone suffers the consequences. The longhouse economy is also a complex web of obligations, debts, and mutual dependencies. People contribute labor, resources, and skills in exchange for shelter and protection. The social contracts that govern these relationships are intricate and binding, creating a system of interdependence that's both supportive and oppressive. The cultural significance. Despite all the hardships, the longhouse serves as the foundation of Viking cultural identity. The shared experiences of winter confinement create bonds that last lifetimes. The stories, songs, and traditions that develop during the dark months become the cultural heritage that defines the community. The longhouse is where Viking culture is literally manufactured. The political structures that emerge from longhouse life form the basis for larger social organization. The skills required to manage a household of 50 people translate directly into the leadership abilities needed to run a community, lead a raid, or negotiate with foreign powers. The longhouse is essentially a training ground for medieval political life. The religious and spiritual dimensions of longhouse life are equally important. The shared rituals, communal prayers, and collective ceremonies that mark the passage of winter create a sense of shared identity and purpose. The longhouse becomes a sacred space where the community's relationship with the gods is maintained and strengthened. The archaeological evidence. Modern archaeology has given us a much clearer picture of longhouse life than the romanticized accounts of medieval literature. Excavations reveal the stark realities of medieval living conditions, the lack of privacy, the primitive sanitation, the constant presence of animals, and the social hierarchies that governed every aspect of daily life. The physical evidence shows high rates of disease, malnutrition, and injury among longhouse inhabitants. Skeletal remains reveal the toll of crowded living conditions, poor diet, and limited medical care. The artifacts found in longhouse sites paint a picture of life that was far more challenging than most people imagine. The layout of excavated longhouses confirms the social hierarchies described in literary sources. The arrangement of sleeping areas, storage spaces, and activity zones reflects the complex social structures that governed medieval Scandinavian society. The longhouse wasn't just a building. It was a physical manifestation of an entire worldview. The psychological legacy. The impact of longhouse living on Viking psychology cannot be overstated. The experience of surviving winter confinement created a mental toughness that served Vikings well in their other endeavors. The ability to function in crowded, stressful conditions translated directly into success in warfare, trading, and exploration. But the psychological cost was enormous. The constant stress of communal living, the lack of privacy, and the pressure to conform to social expectations created mental health challenges that affected entire communities. The high rates of violence, alcoholism, and social dysfunction in Viking society can be traced directly to the pressures of longhouse life. The coping mechanisms developed in longhouse conditions, stoicism, hierarchy, and communal solidarity, became defining characteristics of Viking culture. The ability to endure hardship, maintain social order under pressure, and find meaning in shared suffering became central to Viking identity. The modern parallels. Before we get too smug about our modern living conditions, it's worth noting that many of the challenges faced by Viking longhouse inhabitants are still relevant today. Overcrowding, resource scarcity, and social tension are universal human problems that continue to affect communities worldwide. The longhouse experience offers insights into how humans adapt to extreme conditions and maintain social cohesion under pressure. The longhouse also demonstrates the importance of social hierarchy and clear leadership in crisis situations. The complex web of relationships and obligations that governed longhouse life provided stability and security in an uncertain world. The lessons learned from longhouse living informed Viking approaches to governance, military organization, and social organization. The final verdict. So, would you survive a day in a Viking longhouse? Probably not. The combination of physical discomfort, social pressure, and psychological stress would break most modern people within hours. The romantic image of Vikings gathered around a warm fire, sharing stories and mead, ignores the reality of what life was actually like for the vast majority of people. The longhouse was a remarkable adaptation to harsh environmental conditions, but it was also a form of social organization that prioritized survival over individual comfort. The people who thrived in these conditions were those who could navigate complex social hierarchies, endure physical hardship, and find meaning in communal solidarity. The legacy of the longhouse extends far beyond the Viking Age. The social structures, cultural traditions, and psychological adaptations that emerged from longhouse living influenced the development of medieval European society. The longhouse was more than just a building. It was a laboratory for human social organization that produced insights still relevant today. But let's be honest, you'd be begging for a hotel room within the first hour. The smell alone would send you running for the nearest exit, and the social dynamics would leave you curled up in a corner, rocking back and forth while muttering about your right to privacy. The Vikings who survived longhouse living were tough in ways that most modern people can't even imagine, and their ability to maintain social cohesion under such extreme conditions remains one of the most impressive achievements in human history. The next time you complain about your living situation, remember the longhouse. Remember the 50 people, the livestock, the smoke, the smell, and the complete lack of privacy. Remember that for 6 months out of every year, this was home for millions of people who somehow managed to create one of the most dynamic and influential cultures in human history. And then be grateful that you live in an age of central heating, indoor plumbing, and the revolutionary concept of personal space. Why it sucked to be a Viking woman. Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. Everything you think you know about Viking women is wrong. Popular culture has fed you a steady diet of shield maidens and warrior queens, powerful women who fought alongside men and commanded respect through force of arms. The reality: you'd be lucky to survive your first menstrual cycle, let alone make it to the battlefield. Welcome to the actual experience of womanhood in 9th century Scandinavia, where your value was measured in your ability to produce male heirs. Your legal rights could be revoked by any man in your family, and your life expectancy was roughly equivalent to a modern teenager's attention span. Meet Astrid Eriksdotter, born in 847 CE in a farmstead near modern-day Bergen, Norway. She's not going to become a legendary warrior or a powerful queen. She's going to represent the lived experience of 99.9% of Viking women. And that experience is going to be a masterclass in survival, compromise, and the kind of grinding daily hardship that would make a modern feminist throw her hands up in despair and book the first flight to literally anywhere else. The reality of Viking childhood for girls. Astrid's story begins with a fundamental truth. As a female child in Viking society, she was essentially a commodity with legs. From the moment she drew her first breath, her value was calculated in terms of her future reproductive capacity and the political alliances her marriage could secure. That romanticized notion of Viking gender equality, it evaporates faster than mead at a feast when you examine the archaeological evidence. Female infanticide wasn't uncommon in times of hardship. Resources were limited, and families had to make brutal calculations about which children were worth feeding through the winter. Sons could work the farm, inherit property, and carry on the family name. Daughters were mouths to feed until they could be married off to someone else's family. The Icelandic sagas, for all their literary merit, gloss over the reality that many Viking baby girls never made it past their first birthday. If Astrid was lucky enough to survive infancy, her childhood was a crash course in the skills she'd need to run a medieval household. While her brothers learned to fight, hunt, and manage livestock, she was mastering the intricate arts of textile production, food preservation, and household management. These weren't hobbies. They were survival skills that would determine whether her future family lived or died during the harsh Scandinavian winters. By age 7, Astrid was spinning wool, weaving cloth, and learning the complex social protocols that governed women's interactions. She wasn't playing with dolls. She was caring for actual babies, learning through trial and error how to keep infants alive in conditions that would challenge modern pediatric nurses. The mortality rate for children under 5 was roughly 40%, and much of the responsibility for preventing those deaths fell on young girls like Astrid. The marriage market. Here's where things get really depressing. Astrid's marriage wasn't a romantic choice or even a personal decision. It was a business transaction negotiated between her father and her future husband's family, with Astrid herself having about as much input as a piece of livestock. The typical marriage age for Viking women was 12 to 16 years old, meaning Astrid would be handed off to a stranger while she was still what we'd consider a child. The marriage negotiations involved detailed discussions of dowry, bride price, and the property rights that would transfer with the union. Astrid's father would provide a dowry consisting of household goods, livestock, and sometimes land. Her future husband's family would pay a bride price that compensated her father for the loss of her labor and reproductive capacity. She was literally being bought and sold, and the transaction was considered successful if both sides felt they'd gotten a fair deal. The legal framework surrounding marriage reveals the harsh reality of women's status. A woman couldn't own property independently, couldn't initiate divorce proceedings, and had no legal standing in disputes involving her husband's family. She was essentially transferred from her father's ownership to her husband's, with her legal identity completely subsumed under male authority. The romantic notion of Viking women as independent agents of their own destiny is pure fantasy. But here's the twist that makes it even worse. Astrid was expected to be grateful for this arrangement. Viking culture taught women that marriage was their highest calling, their path to respectability and social value. A woman who remained unmarried was considered incomplete, a burden on her family, and a potential source of shame. The pressure to accept whatever marriage was arranged for her was enormous. The reality of Viking pregnancy and childbirth. Now let's talk about the aspect of Viking womanhood that would absolutely terrify any modern woman: pregnancy and childbirth in medieval conditions. Astrid's primary function in her new marriage was to produce children, particularly male heirs, who could inherit property and carry on the family name. The biological reality of constant pregnancy in medieval conditions was a death sentence delivered in installments. The average Viking woman who survived to adulthood would be pregnant 8 to 12 times during her reproductive years. Of those pregnancies, roughly 30% would end in miscarriage or stillbirth. Of the children who survived birth, 40% would die before age 5. The psychological toll of constantly losing children in a society that desperately needed population growth was devastating. Medieval medicine had no understanding of basic hygiene, infection control, or proper nutrition during pregnancy. Astrid would give birth in the same longhouse where animals were kept, assisted by women whose medical knowledge consisted of folk remedies and superstition. The mortality rate for women in childbirth was approximately 20%, meaning that 1 in 5 women died during delivery. Those who survived often suffered from complications that affected their health for the rest of their lives. The physical demands of constant pregnancy and childbirth in harsh conditions aged women rapidly. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking women in their 20s often had the bone density and joint wear of modern women in their 40s. The romanticized image of powerful Viking matriarchs commanding respect through wisdom and experience ignores the reality that most women were physically broken by their reproductive years. The domestic burden. Let's destroy another myth: the notion that Viking women shared domestic responsibilities equally with men. The reality was that women did the vast majority of household labor, while men were away raiding, trading, or engaging in the political activities that shaped Viking society. Astrid's daily routine would make a modern working mother's schedule look like a vacation. Her day began before dawn with milking cows, feeding livestock, and preparing breakfast for the household. The longhouse's central hearth needed constant tending. The the fire couldn't be allowed to die, or the entire household would freeze. Food preparation was a continuous process involving grinding grain, preserving meat, brewing ale, and managing the complex logistics of feeding 20 to 50 people with limited resources. Textile production was equally demanding. Every piece of clothing, every blanket, every sail for the family's boats had to be produced by hand. The process began with shearing sheep, continued through spinning wool into thread, weaving thread into cloth, and finally sewing cloth into finished goods. A single woolen cloak required approximately 200 hours of skilled labor to produce. Astrid would spend 60 to 80% of her waking hours on textile-related activities. The seasonal cycle of food preservation was another crushing responsibility. Summer and autumn were spent frantically preparing for winter, smoking fish, drying meat, pickling vegetables, and brewing the ale that would sustain the household through months of darkness. The margin for error was non-existent. A single mistake in food preservation could mean starvation for the entire family. The legal nightmare. Viking law codes reveal the harsh reality of women's legal status. While some popular histories emphasize the relatively progressive aspects of Norse law regarding women, the reality was that women existed in a legal limbo that made them vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, and abandonment. Astrid's rights were contingent on her relationships with men and could be revoked at any time. Property rights were particularly problematic. While women could theoretically inherit property, they couldn't control it independently. A woman's property was managed by her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her son after her husband's death. If she had no male relatives, her property could be seized by distant male relatives, or even non-relatives, who could demonstrate some claim to male authority over her. Divorce was theoretically possible, but practically difficult for women to obtain. A woman could seek divorce in cases of physical abuse, abandonment, or her husband's failure to provide for the household. But divorce proceedings required male advocates, substantial evidence, and the approval of male community leaders. The social stigma attached to divorced women made remarriage difficult, leaving them economically vulnerable and socially isolated. The legal penalties for crimes against women reveal their subordinate status. The compensation for killing a woman was typically half that for killing a man of equivalent social status. Rape was considered a property crime against the woman's father or husband, rather than a crime against the woman herself. The legal system treated women as valuable objects, rather than autonomous individuals with inherent rights. The violence problem. Here's something the romanticized versions of Viking culture don't like to discuss. Domestic violence was endemic in Viking society, and women had virtually no protection from abusive husbands. The combination of a warrior culture that valorized violence, alcohol consumption as a social norm, and legal systems that treated women as property created a perfect storm of gendered violence. Archaeological evidence from Viking-era graves shows high rates of healed bone fractures in women, consistent with repeated physical abuse. The legal codes that governed domestic relationships essentially gave husbands the right to discipline their wives through physical violence, as long as they didn't cause permanent disability or death. The line between acceptable discipline and criminal abuse was drawn by men, enforced by men, and interpreted in ways that consistently favored male authority. The seasonal cycle of raiding and trading meant that men were often away for months at a time, then returned home psychologically traumatized by violence and accustomed to solving problems through force. The adjustment to domestic life was difficult for warriors who had spent months killing people and taking their possessions. Women bore the brunt of this psychological readjustment, often suffering violence from husbands who couldn't transition from warrior mode to domestic life. The longhouses' communal living arrangements made domestic violence a public spectacle, but they didn't provide protection for victims. The social hierarchy that governed longhouse life meant that other residents were reluctant to intervene in domestic disputes, particularly when the abuser was the head of the household or held significant political power. Women had nowhere to escape and no legal recourse for protection. The economic exploitation. The economic reality of Viking women's lives reveals another layer of exploitation that popular culture conveniently ignores. Women's labor was essential to the functioning of Viking society, but it was neither compensated nor recognized as economically valuable. Astrid's work in textile production, food preservation, and household management generated enormous economic value, but she had no claim to the profits from her labor. The textile industry was particularly exploitative. Viking women produced the cloth that was traded throughout Europe, generating wealth that financed raiding expeditions and political activities. But the profits from textile production went to male family members who controlled the trade relationships and managed the financial transactions. Women did the skilled labor. Men got the economic benefits. The seasonal nature of male economic activities meant that women were responsible for maintaining the household economy during the long periods when men were away. This included managing agricultural production, supervising livestock, and maintaining the complex web of social relationships that governed local trade. Women essentially ran the medieval economy, while men got credit for its success. The inheritance system reinforced women's economic vulnerability. While women could inherit property, they couldn't control it independently or pass it on to their own children without male approval. This meant that women's economic security was always contingent on their relationships with men, making them vulnerable to abandonment, abuse, and exploitation. The child-rearing nightmare. Let's talk about what it was actually like to raise children in Viking conditions. Astrid would be responsible for keeping her children alive in an environment that killed 40% of children before age 5. The combination of poor nutrition, endemic disease, and harsh living conditions made child mortality a constant threat that shaped every aspect of motherhood. The medieval understanding of child development was limited and often counterproductive. Children were considered miniature adults rather than beings with unique developmental needs. They were expected to contribute to household labor from an early age, meaning that Astrid had to balance their survival needs with the economic demands of the household. A child who couldn't work was a burden. A child who worked too hard might not survive. The psychological impact of constant child mortality on mothers was devastating. Women were expected to remain stoic in the face of losing children, to continue producing babies to replace those who died, and to maintain the household's emotional stability despite their own grief. The social support systems for grieving mothers were limited, particularly in cultures that valued emotional control and viewed excessive mourning as weakness. The educational responsibilities of Viking mothers were enormous. Children learned essential survival skills through observation and practice, meaning that mothers had to be expert teachers in everything from textile production to food preservation to social protocol. A mother's failure to properly educate her children could mean their death or social ostracism, making child rearing a high-stakes responsibility with little margin for error. The religious restrictions. Viking religion, despite its modern reputation for female empowerment, actually reinforced many of the social restrictions that limited women's lives. While some goddesses held positions of power in the Norse pantheon, the religious practices that governed daily life were heavily skewed toward male authority and female subordination. The concept of female honor in Viking culture was tied directly to sexual purity and reproductive success. A woman's reputation could be destroyed by rumors of sexual impropriety, and there was no equivalent social stigma for men who engaged in extramarital relationships. The religious framework that governed marriage and family life essentially made women responsible for maintaining moral standards while giving men freedom to violate those same standards. The ritual responsibilities of Viking women were significant but subordinate. Women were responsible for maintaining household shrines, preparing ritual foods, and ensuring that the family's religious obligations were met. But the major religious ceremonies were conducted by male priests, and women's spiritual authority was limited to domestic contexts. The religious system that supposedly empowered women actually reinforced their confinement to domestic spheres. The afterlife beliefs of Viking culture reflected the gender hierarchies of earthly life. While Valhalla was reserved for warriors who died in battle, women who died in childbirth were supposed to go to Folkvanger Freyja's hall. But the descriptions of these afterlife destinations make it clear that, even in death, women were expected to serve male warriors and maintain domestic responsibilities. There was no escape from gender roles, even in the afterlife. The social isolation. The social structure of Viking society created profound isolation for women, particularly those who were married into communities where they had no family connections. Astrid would likely be married to a man from a different region, meaning she'd be cut off from her childhood support networks and forced to navigate complex social hierarchies with no allies. The longhouses' communal living arrangements created the illusion of social connection, but the reality was that women were surrounded by people who had little incentive to support them. The other women in the household were potential rivals for resources and social status. The men controlled the political and economic decisions that affected everyone's lives. Children were economic assets rather than sources of emotional support. The seasonal cycle of male absences created additional social isolation. When men were away raiding or trading, women were left to manage household crises with limited resources and no male authority to resolve disputes. The responsibility for maintaining social cohesion fell on women, but they lacked the formal authority to enforce their decisions. The geographic isolation of many Viking settlements compounded the social isolation. Communities might be separated by days of travel through dangerous terrain, making it difficult for women to maintain relationships with family members or friends from other households. The combination of social and geographic isolation created a psychological prison that many women never escaped. The health crisis. The health challenges facing Viking women were staggering, and they had virtually no access to effective medical care. The combination of constant pregnancy, poor nutrition, and harsh living conditions created a perfect storm of health problems that would challenge modern medical systems. Nutritional deficiencies were endemic among Viking women. The diet was heavy on preserved foods that had limited nutritional value, and women typically ate after men and children had taken their share. Iron deficiency from repeated pregnancies and poor diet was so common that it shows up in the archaeological record as a defining characteristic of Viking women's skeletal remains. The lack of understanding about basic hygiene and infection control meant that minor health problems often became life-threatening conditions. A simple cut could become infected and lead to death. Dental problems were universal, and the pain of rotting teeth was something that women had to endure with no effective treatment options. The psychological health impacts of Viking women's lives were equally severe. The constant stress of survival, the trauma of losing children, and the grinding hardship of daily life created what we now recognize as widespread depression and anxiety. But medieval culture had no framework for understanding or treating mental health problems, leaving women to suffer in silence. The marginalized within the marginalized. Within the already restricted world of Viking women, some groups faced additional layers of oppression that made their lives even more precarious. Enslaved women, widows, and women from conquered territories faced challenges that would make even the difficult life of a free Viking woman seem privileged. Female slaves had no legal rights, no protection from abuse, and no hope of improving their circumstances. They were property that could be bought, sold, or killed at their owner's whim. The sexual exploitation of female slaves was so common that it was considered a normal part of household management. These women lived in constant fear of violence, with no legal recourse and no social support. Widows faced their own set of challenges. While some widows inherited property and gained limited independence, most were vulnerable to being stripped of their assets by male relatives or community leaders. The social pressure to remarry was enormous, but remarriage often meant accepting a lower social status and losing what little autonomy widowhood had provided. Women from conquered territories who were incorporated into Viking society through marriage or slavery faced the additional challenge of cultural displacement. They had to learn new languages, adapt to different social customs, and navigate unfamiliar legal systems, all while dealing with the trauma of conquest and separation from their original communities. The myth of the Shield Maiden. Let's address the elephant in the room, the Shield Maiden myth that has dominated popular representations of Viking women. The archaeological evidence for women warriors is extremely limited, and the literary sources that describe female fighters are largely mythological rather than historical. The reality is that the vast majority of Viking women never held a weapon in anger, let alone fought in battles. The few historical examples of women taking up arms were typically responses to extreme circumstances, defending their homes when men were away, or exceptional individuals who broke social norms at great personal cost. These women were noteworthy precisely because they were so unusual, not because female warriors were common or accepted in Viking society. The romanticization of shield maidens has obscured the reality of women's lives in Viking society. By focusing on the mythical few who supposedly fought alongside men, we've ignored the experiences of the millions of women who lived and died in domestic obscurity. The Shield Maiden myth is a distraction from the real story of Viking women's lives, which was defined by survival, compromise, and the daily grind of keeping their families alive in hostile conditions. The political implications of the Shield Maiden myth are troubling. By suggesting that Viking women achieved equality through violence, we are implying that women's rights are conditional on their ability to fight like men. This narrative ignores the ways that women actually exercised power in Viking society through household management, textile production, and the complex social networks that held communities together. The economic reality. The economic contributions of Viking women were enormous, but they were systematically undervalued and ignored by the male-dominated political system. Women's work in textile production, food preservation, and household management generated the surplus wealth that financed Viking expansion. But they had no claim to the profits from their labor. The seasonal nature of Viking economic activity meant that women were responsible for maintaining the household economy during the long periods when men were away. This included managing agricultural production, supervising livestock, and maintaining the trade relationships that sustained local communities. Women essentially ran the medieval economy, while men got credit for its success. The inheritance system reinforced women's economic vulnerability. While women could inherit property, they couldn't control it independently or pass it on to their own children without male approval. This meant that women's economic security was always contingent on their relationships with men, making them vulnerable to abandonment, abuse, and exploitation. The lack of economic independence made it impossible for women to escape abusive relationships or improve their circumstances through their own efforts. They were trapped in a system that extracted maximum value from their labor while giving them no control over the fruits of that labor. The cultural legacy. Despite the hardships they faced, Viking women were the primary transmitters of cultural knowledge and social values. They taught children the skills needed for survival, maintained the oral traditions that preserved historical memory, and managed the complex social relationships that held communities together. The textile work that consumed so much of women's time was also a form of artistic expression and cultural preservation. The intricate patterns and designs that women wove into cloth carried symbolic meanings and cultural significance that connected communities across vast distances. Women's textile production was literally weaving the cultural fabric of Viking society. The religious and ritual responsibilities of women were essential to maintaining community cohesion. Women prepared the foods for religious ceremonies, maintained household shrines, and ensured that the complex web of religious obligations was fulfilled. Their spiritual labor was as important as their physical labor in maintaining the social order. The social networks that women maintained through kinship ties, marriage alliances, and trading relationships were the foundation of Viking political organization. Women's ability to navigate these complex relationships and maintain connections across communities was essential to the functioning of Viking society. The archaeological evidence. Modern archaeology has revealed the harsh realities of Viking women's lives with brutal clarity. Skeletal remains show evidence of malnutrition, repeated pregnancies, and physical abuse that paint a picture far different from the romanticized narratives of popular culture. The grave goods found in women's burials reveal the importance of textile production and household management in defining female identity. Women were buried with the tools of their trade: spindles, looms, and household implements, rather than weapons or symbols of political power. Their identities were defined by their domestic roles, not their individual achievements. The settlement patterns revealed by archaeological excavation show the constrained nature of women's lives. Women's activities were centered around the longhouse and its immediate surroundings, while men's activities extended across vast distances through trading, raiding, and political networks. The physical evidence confirms that women's lives were defined by domestic confinement. The demographic data from archaeological sites reveals the devastating impact of constant pregnancy and poor living conditions on women's health. The mortality rates for women in their reproductive years were significantly higher than for men, and the physical toll of repeated pregnancies is visible in the skeletal record. The psychological impact. The psychological toll of Viking women's lives was enormous, but it was rarely acknowledged or addressed by medieval society. The constant stress of survival, the trauma of losing children, and the grinding hardship of daily life created what we'd now recognize as widespread mental health problems. The social expectations placed on women were psychologically crushing. They were expected to remain stoic in the face of loss, to continue producing children despite high mortality rates, and to maintain the emotional stability of their households, regardless of their own suffering. The pressure to conform to these expectations was enormous, and the penalties for failure were severe. The isolation experienced by many Viking women compounded their psychological distress. Married into communities where they had no family connections, surrounded by people who had little incentive to support them, and cut off from their childhood support networks. Many women suffered in silence with no one to turn to for help. The lack of agency in their own lives created a sense of helplessness that affected every aspect of women's existence. They couldn't choose their husbands, couldn't control their reproductive lives, and couldn't escape abusive relationships. This powerlessness was psychologically devastating and contributed to the high rates of depression and anxiety that characterized women's lives. The resilience factor. Despite the overwhelming challenges they faced, Viking women demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. They developed complex survival strategies that allowed them to navigate the constraints of their society while maintaining their humanity and protecting their families. The social networks that women created and maintained were sources of mutual support and shared knowledge. Women shared information about survival techniques, provided emotional support during crises, and created informal systems of mutual aid that helped them cope with the challenges of daily life. The cultural traditions that women preserved and transmitted were sources of meaning and identity that helped them maintain psychological resilience. The stories, songs, and rituals that women passed down through generations provided frameworks for understanding suffering and finding purpose in difficult circumstances. The skills that women developed in household management textile production, and child rearing were sources of pride and accomplishment that gave them a sense of competence and value, despite the lack of formal recognition for their contributions. Women knew that their work was essential to their family's survival and their community's prosperity. The historical significance. The lives of Viking women reveal fundamental truths about the nature of medieval society and the ways that gender, class, and power intersected to shape individual experiences. Their stories challenge romanticized narratives about the past and force us to confront the reality of what life was like for the vast majority of people in medieval Europe. The economic contributions of Viking women were essential to the expansion and success of Viking civilization, but they were systematically undervalued and ignored by the male-dominated political system. This pattern of extracting maximum value from women's labor while denying them control over the fruits of that labor is a recurring theme in human history. The legal and social restrictions that governed women's lives in Viking society were not unique to Norse culture, but reflected broader patterns of gender inequality that characterized medieval Europe. The specific forms that these restrictions took were shaped by local conditions, but the underlying structure of male dominance was universal. The resilience and adaptability that Viking women demonstrated in the face of overwhelming challenges provide insights into the human capacity for survival and resistance. Their stories remind us that even in the most oppressive circumstances, people find ways to maintain their humanity and protect what they value most. The modern relevance. The experiences of Viking women remain relevant to contemporary discussions about gender equality, economic justice, and human rights. The patterns of exploitation and oppression that characterize their lives continue to shape women's experiences in many parts of the world today. The myth of the Shield Maiden and the romanticization of Viking women's lives reflect contemporary desires to find historical precedents for women's equality and empowerment. But these myths can be dangerous if they obscure the real experiences of women in the past and present. The archaeological and historical evidence about Viking women's lives provides important insights into the ways that gender inequality is constructed and maintained through legal systems, economic structures, and cultural narratives. These insights can inform contemporary efforts to create more equitable societies. The resilience and survival strategies that Viking women developed in the face of overwhelming challenges provide inspiration for contemporary women facing their own struggles for equality and justice. Their stories remind us that resistance takes many forms and that survival itself can be a form of resistance. The final reckoning. So, would you survive as a Viking woman? The honest answer is probably not. The combination of physical hardship, legal vulnerability, and social isolation would break most modern women within weeks. The romanticized image of powerful Viking women commanding respect and wielding authority is a fantasy that ignores the brutal realities of medieval life. The real story of Viking women is one of survival, compromise, and the daily grind of keeping families alive in hostile conditions. It's a story of women who found ways to create meaning and maintain relationships despite overwhelming constraints. It's a story of resilience in the face of oppression and dignity in the face of dehumanization. But it's also a story of systematic exploitation and oppression that should make us grateful for the progress that has been made in women's rights while remaining vigilant about the work that still needs to be done. The lives of Viking women remind us that gender equality is not a natural state, but a hard-won achievement that requires constant effort to maintain. The next time you see a movie or read a book about powerful Viking women, remember Astrid Eriksdottir and the millions of women like her who lived and died in domestic obscurity. Remember that their contributions were essential to the success of Viking civilization, even though they were never given credit for their work. Remember that their stories matter, not because they were exceptional, but because they were ordinary people who found ways to survive and maintain their humanity in extraordinary circumstances. The legacy of Viking women is not found in mythical shield maidens or powerful queens, but in the countless ordinary women who kept their families alive, preserved their culture, and passed on their knowledge to future generations. Their true achievement was not conquest or glory, but the simple act of survival in a world that seemed designed to break them. And in that survival, they demonstrated a form of heroism that deserves to be remembered and honored, even if it was never celebrated in the great halls of their time.